for a minute straight is there's two parts of this radio station that the Maritime Radio Historical Society has been working on. And the first one is the one that was advertised, KPH, ship to shore, Morse code radio telegraphy, radio telegrams to ships at sea. But the other part is, I think, even more interesting. So I hope you'll forgive me. I'm going to shift over and talk about that because it's what folks may know less about. And this is the original purpose of Marconi's whole business plan. That is to say, wireless communication between the continents, connecting the continents by radio. And that is really what is to me, just the most amazing bit of history. And for the reason that folks may not be 100% aware of a lot of it, and the fact that we have recently, over the last 2 years, gotten some truly extraordinary photos from that era that I wanted to share with you. So for that reason, I'm going to concentrate on this so-called point-to-point, this transoceanic communications, which was Marconi's business plan right from the beginning. So I am going to press a couple of buttons here so that I can start our, let's see how I can do this now. I'm going to share the screen first, I guess, and then I'll start the slideshow. All right, there we go. So we've done a lot of these, but if anybody can't see the slide, should let me know now. But we, the station here on the coast of Marin, where I'm located, began life in the early part of the last century, and it continued right up until 1997. And when the station closed, it was a great blow. I mean, I never worked there. I was a visitor since the early 70s, but I didn't lose my job. I didn't lose my career. But like all of those folks did, and it used to be that if you worked at KPH or the point-to-point station and you wanted to move on, you took your license and you went to the next place. Well, there was no next place. This was the end of the road. This was the last thing. So it was a tremendous blow, and it was for a lot of people. I remember when we had the ceremony at down at Half Moon Bay, which was where the final transmission was sent after the license had been purchased and moved down there. Well, you saw a lot of guys who were really tough looking hombres. These were the radio officers who had spent their lives at sea. The guys who you would never mess with in a bar, just these grizzled guys, and they were just weeping because their life was passing away. But we're going to concentrate on the point-to-point part of it, and maybe some other time, if folks want, we can really get into the KPH part of it. But one of the first things that people started to notice if they were experimenters in the field in the late 1800s, and here prominent, there were many folks, as people in the audience here probably know, but prominent among them was Hertz. And here's a drawing of Hertz, and he's having a spark gap on his induction coil there, and he's noticing that across the room he can get a spark to jump across this little loop of wire that he's got. So folks knew something was up. I mean, but it was kind of a laboratory phenomena. It was something that really don't know what's going on here, don't see much to do with it. Very interesting, worthy of study. But along comes Guglielmo Marconi, very nice Italian boy, and he just gets the radio bug like so many of us have. The difference was there was no radio back then. So he was kind of not only inventing the radio, but inventing the radio bug. And I know there's a lot of debate on the idea of inventing radio, but I think what we can say is that Marconi really did see all these phenomena that were happening and thought that maybe there was a way to put them together in a way that was actually a business plan, a way to make money. And his plan, as we said, was to connect the continents by radio. But that was well in the future. So now he's a young man, and he's fiddling around out in the garden in his father's estate near Bologna in Italy. And he's got, as you see here, some stuff, and he's using this metal sheet as an antenna. And he thought that this was just the most fascinating thing. And he wasn't a scientist, he wasn't an engineer, and it's a good thing he wasn't, because all the scientists and all the engineers are telling him, look, what's the matter for you? Don't you know radio waves don't go over the horizon? Everybody knows that. Radio waves don't go through dirt. You can't get any radio transmission beyond visual range. Well, he was getting 5 miles, he was getting 10 miles. His equipment would improve, and he'd just try this and see how that worked. And he'd try something else and see how that worked. But he was getting these longer and longer ranges, and they really proved to him that the idea that the radio waves wouldn't travel beyond the horizon, he knew that wasn't true. I mean, when he was out there at 50 and 100 miles, the radio waves should have been way, way, way above his head, beyond anything that his antenna could capture, and yet he's still receiving these things. So his imagination was fired, and his objective was just greater range all the time. Now, none of the scientists and none of the engineers, none of the academics really understood this or believed much in it, and they had other alternate explanations as to how this might be happening. They really didn't really think that this still was a proposition that needed to be paid attention to. And neither did his father. Now, his father, Giuseppe, said, look, this is, you should go into the Navy, you should have a profession. But his mother, his Irish mother, the heiress to the Jameson whiskey fortune, she had our, unusual for the time, but she had our own independent means of funding. And she believed in her son. And she said, okay, Guglielmo, I believe in you. I don't understand what you're doing, but I see it has promise, and I want to support you, son. So here, you go down to ham radio outlet, get everything that you need. Here's my credit card. Well, of course, there was no ham radio outlet. He had to build everything from scratch, which he did. And she believed in him. And he never forgot the fact that his father did not support him. In fact, he never went to his father's funeral. Now, there's a man who knows how to keep a grudge, much respect, but he didn't go to the old man's funeral. He never forgot that. Well, we're going to jump ahead now. He has, based on the experiments that he has done, crossing the English Channel, reporting yacht races by wireless to the newspapers, he's now formed his company. And he's got a board of directors. He's by far the largest stockholder, but he says, look, I got 100 miles. I got 500 miles. I got 1,000 miles, right? Nobody argues that, right? No, that's right. We don't argue that. If not 1,000 miles, why not 3,000 miles? Why not across the Atlantic? Of course, that is the big jump. That is the thing. And the idea was that he would compete with the undersea cables, and that's a whole other fascinating story. But he was going to compete with the undersea cables, which up to then had the monopoly on electric communication between the continents. You wanted to send a telegram to the US and across the ocean, you had to depend on the cables. And of course, since they had a monopoly, they were charging you through the nose for that. So he said, no, I think I can do it across the Atlantic. So here is a photograph of the great transmitting station in Poldhu on the coast at Cornwall in the UK. Now here's the antenna system. Now take a look at this. Remember now, they're on the coast, the Atlantic coast, right, in Cornwall. And here's these sticks. And you notice there's triadics going around all the top, and then at the different levels. Now, what's going to happen in the first storm? We all know that. Just one of them goes down, the whole thing goes. So, but nevertheless, okay, this is what he's built, the most powerful station existing by far, and a similar receiving station in the U.S. On Cape Cod. So he's going to go over there, he's going to listen, and he's going to listen for that signal and prove that he can transmit across the ocean. So of course the first storm comes, and what do you expect? There it is, all on the ground. How many of us have gone through that kind of heartbreak? Maybe not at this scale, but after an ice storm, you look out at your 75-meter dipole, maybe it's not doing so good. Well, same thing happened at the receive station. Same thing. So time and time again, the biographers, the people who write about Marconi, and there's many things to say, both pro and con, about what kind of man he was. And well, one thing they all agree on, he never lost heart, and he was willing, and he did multiple times, to put his reputation and his fortune and his company on the line for what he believed in. Now here's this wreckage on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Um, just completely disheartening. Another man would have said, okay, that's it, we'll come back another day, we're done here, or maybe given up entirely. Not him. So he got the folks in Poldhu to rebuild as best they could with another antenna. But on the receive side, he was kind of stuck. What am I going to do here? So they ended up at Newfoundland, St. John's. I don't know how many folks have been in Newfoundland in December. I have. I can tell you that's one cold spot. He's not only at Newfoundland in December, he's on top of a hill in St. John's, Newfoundland, overlooking the ocean. There was, it's called Signal Hill. And the building that he was in, this kind of stone tower, still exists today. Of course, it's an enormously historic spot. But here he is with his assistants. They've been very graciously given the use of this tower to set up their receiving. Now you notice, and by the way, you see George Kemp, his faithful assistant, over there on the right side. Now look at that mustache. That's a man's mustache, and the best Marconi could do with this scraggly ass little mustache. But George Kemp, man, you know, he's growing that thing. And they're sitting, it's significant here because they're sitting on, you notice, this wicker basket. And in the basket is a couple of balloons. And behind them, you see, is a kite. So that's what they're going to use. After all this enormous expense of putting up this tremendous receiving antenna that looked just like the one in Poldhu, which is now on the ground, a bunch of matchsticks, they're going to loft a wire using a balloon or a kite to see if they can receive this signal from across the ocean. Well, okay, so here it is, middle of December, it's blowing a gale, they're freezing. They get out there and they get the balloon out of the basket and send it up on the wire. Of course, the wire parts, the balloon disappears downwind, never to be seen again. I don't know whether they tried that again with the balloon, but finally they went with the kite. Now, one of the things that Marconi was known for is his kite handling. At least that's what all the biographers say. The man knew how to handle a kite. All right, good. Well, that's just what was being called for here, because here they are trying to get this thing aloft, and you can sort of see by the way the folks are crouching here. You know, the wind is just ripping through there, and they're going to get this thing up in the air, and they do. They do. They get it up, and it's bobbing and weaving, you know, up in the sky. But they get it up there, and it's staying there. It's not blowing away. So okay, they have some semblance of a receiving antenna. Now, meanwhile, back in Cornwall at Poldhu, they're sending that famous single letter S, dot, 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 3 dots over and over and over and over, and hoping that somehow the signal is going to arc over the dome of the earth and somehow be received here at Signal Hill in St. John's. So that's the hope. And there he is. He's sitting at the table inside this place. They're freezing, and the apparatus is on the table that he's going to be listening with. Now, what are they listening with? They're listening with a coherer. A lot of folks here probably know what a coherer is, and here's an illustration of it. It's this evacuated glass tube with 2 brass plugs in it and some filings, and the composition of the filings is really important. But this thing, by our point of view today, is about as sensitive to radio signals as a 10-penny nail. But they were making it work. They were making it work. This had been used in the past. And the thing is that, okay, so here's your coherer. Why do they call it a coherer? Because when the radio waves arrive and are impressed on this thing, those filings cohere, and the thing conducts. But when the radio signal goes away, it does not automatically stop cohering. It stays cohered. So these things are usually assembled with kind of a clapper next to them, like a bell, that would then reset it. and you didn't listen to it by ear. You listened to it, if you could call it listening, with a tape inker. So you see the dots and dashes actually inked on the tape, and that's how you read your message. Now, the advantage of that was you actually had a physical record of what was received. So here he is. He's up on the top of Signal Hill in St. John's, Newfoundland, and he's got his coherer, and he's got his inker, and he's got his thing, and he's got his kite, everything. Nothing happening, zero. So he thought, boy, okay, maybe I can hear it by ear. So he's got this earphone, and this is the one. It's been preserved, and you see he modified it with a horseshoe magnet and a coil. Not sure exactly what he had in mind here. Well, I know what he had in mind. It was to increase the sensitivity of the earphone. Exactly how he figured that was working, I'm not sure. I've never seen a full technical description of this thing, but maybe others have. So, okay, he takes the inker out of the circuit, and he holds the earphone up to his ear, and he listens. And he hands the earphone over to Kemp, and he says, "Mr. Kemp, do you hear anything?" Now, Kemp is put in a difficult position here at this point, because I mean, here he is, he's freezing. He's freezing. What he's thinking about is that warm, hot meal, warm bed. So of course he says, "Yes, yes, I hear it." I hear those letters. Well, you can start a fight in a radio man's ball to this day by claiming that either Marconi did or did not receive that letter S on that day. But it really doesn't make any difference, because within less than a decade, he's got this system, this wireless system connecting the continents, just like he always said he would. And here's a diagram of some, and you see on the dot there, San Francisco. That's the station we're going to be talking about. But you see, it's a globe girdling network. So he proved, whether or not he received that S was immaterial almost. He went ahead based on that, and he proved it after that. But testing from ships going westerly across the ocean, and he achieved that range and more. So he proved it, and then he started true energetic construction of the stations that you see here on the map. So one of the big things for getting across the Pacific from North America was, of course, San Francisco, and that was going to be the site of the West Coast North American Station. And again, this is point to point. This is not involving ships. This is getting messages between the continents. So here's some guys, and they come up here to Marin County, where I'm living. And they're looking around here. Here's some surveyors. And there's this ranch just a little bit north of the town of Bolinas. And they say, "This looks good to me." A lot of flat land out there, right on the edge of the ocean, which is really what you wanted. Close enough to civilization, meaning San Francisco, that it wouldn't be an enormous expense to connect up with the terrestrial telegraph system, which you had to do in San Francisco. And also, very important, close enough to civilization to bring in power. And a lot of the other stations that we saw on that map, they had to actually build a power plant right on site. And you can imagine with stations this big, how much that took. But here they could conserve. And they brought in lines from two substations, from Alto and Woodacre, and we still see that marked, still see those names marked on the switchboard at the station. So here they are. Okay, they're saying, "Okay, this looks good to me." And a little while later, boom, here's the same photograph taken from virtually the same spot. And so you see the Marconi mast holding the antenna, and out here on the edge is the transmitting building, which we now call Building 1, still exists. And here you see a bunch of other buildings. There's a hotel and two cottages. And that is, the hotel is for the working staff, and the cottages are for the chief engineer and the station manager. And that was tradition at these stations, because usually they were so isolated. So how did they get from that vacant land to what we see here in this picture? Well, remember now, there was no Panama Canal. They had to send everything from the east coast of the US around the Horn. Some might have come, we have folks that say they believe that a lot of it also may have come by rail, but it all ended up in San Francisco. So they had to bring it across San Francisco Bay on schooners. The most famous one is the Owl. And they reinforced the wharf at Bolinas to bring this stuff up, because you can imagine just the weight of this stuff. And you'll see some pictures of it to get a real idea of this. So here they go. They're going to build this thing. And here it is now. Here they're bringing some of the cables for that station. This is Mesa Road. This is still how you get to the transmitting station today. And you see it, some things never change. You know, here's maybe one or two guys working, everybody else watching, standing around watching. Well, you notice they're not even using a wagon here. They're using a sledge. And we have some contemporary accounts of folks who tried to visit the station once it was built in the rainy season, and they literally say the horses just about disappeared in the mud. I mean, it was so horrendously bad to be able to get there, but they did it. Anyway, they did it. Now, here is something that at first glance doesn't look like much. And when I first saw it, I didn't think it looked like much, but I'm including it here because it was a revelation to me. Now, what we're looking at is this thing here, right? This piece of concrete with this L bracket on it. Now, behind it, over here, is where that building one that we saw in the earlier picture, that isn't even erected yet. So here's this thing. Now, when I first got out there, and this is, I think, in fact, I'm sure, 1972. And I see this, and it's overgrown, and there's weeds, and there's other stuff around, but I see this thing, and I'm trying to puzzle out what it is. And to me, I say, well, okay, it's a cement wall that's fallen over. And it doesn't really make much sense. The best I could come up with. The L bracket was gone, wasn't there. But then I noticed these threaded rods coming out of it here. They were still there. And finally, it dawned on me what I was actually looking at. And that kind of process happens a lot out there. To me, it's kind of like Easter Island. I mean, there's so many artifacts in that field back into radio history so far that it really takes a long time to get your mind around it, and there's always more. Okay, so what is this thing? Well, it's the anchor for the antenna, and here it is now looking in the other direction. Now, building one is now behind the photographer, and you're looking out a mile or two away to Mesa Road, where those guys were dragging up that cable. And you see all the wires that comprise the antenna. Now, the insulators are up here. Here's the insulators, and the feed lines then branch off from the insulators and go up into the transmitter building, and here are the mechanical anchors coming down to this cement anchor. So finally I realized what that was, and it just was, you know, amazing to be standing on it. So that's part of it. And here's building one. Now they've got it done. And again, you see the antenna, the insulators here, and then the anchor down here. And so building one. And what's inside building one? Well, the standard Marconi transoceanic transmitter of the time, and we're talking early teens here. This station went into service in February 1914. So the standard transmitter was a giant rotary gap, rated, depends on where you look. Who knows how they actually rated these things, but they say 230 kilowatts. So here's this rotary gap. And here's a picture of it. So you see that the gap itself is housed in this alloy housing here. And here's the flange for the drive motor, and it's on this cast base here. So that's just the arc. And it's in, as I say, in an alloy housing. But even though it's in an alloy housing, and as you'll see in subsequent pictures, the whole thing is in a separate soundproof room, still the contemporary accounts that we see on this all say you could hear this thing a mile away. Well, here this is one of the pictures that we just recently, within the last couple of years, came up with, so you get an idea of what the installation was. Now, I guess I would have rather not have the writing on it, but on the other hand, Great. Now we know exactly what we're looking at. You know, any piece of paper that might have been associated with this thing didn't get lost. We know exactly what we're looking at. So here is the 500 horsepower motor, and it's driving the alternator here. And here you see the wheel to adjust the phase of the alternator. Excuse me. And then in this room behind here is where that rotary spark gap is, supposedly soundproofed. So unbelievable. This is what they're using. Plus, there's all kinds of excuse me, all kinds of auxiliary equipment that goes with this. But this is the heart of the matter right here. And here's another view. Now, to me, it looks like there's a backup one here. I mean, it looks identical to me, but I've never seen in any of the literature actually mentioning that. And the guy who wrote all this doesn't say anything about it either. So, but that's what it looks like. And up above here, this is all the coupling gear that you need to take that gap and the energy that it produces from the collapsing field. And you all know how spark gaps work, the damped wave as opposed to the continuous wave that we use these days. And there you are. So there's just tons and tons more as well. But you see, it was no small undertaking. And the building still exists. All this, not the infrastructure, but a lot of the framing and everything that you see, it's still there. And this shows some of the auxiliary machinery we were talking about, and it says why you need it. It even tells who made it. Roots, by the way, Roots blowers, folks who are hot rodders might know the type of positive displacement blowers that you use on motors. So, okay, they made these compressors as well. And you needed to blow out the quench gap of the rotary, and also the high-speed keying, the keying signal on the contacts. So you can imagine what's going on. I mean, this is Frankenstein stuff. This thing is, it's just death to go anywhere near this stuff, it seems. But men were men, and they knew what they were doing. So this is just part of what was going on in that transmitting facility, and it worked. It worked. Now here are some of the more extraordinary photos that we recently got. Now take a look at this. So there's building one, we already know. That's building one, and you see how close the cliff was. And then you notice this circle here, right? This circle around the building. This is what we would call today a halo ground. This is the ground system. This is where all the ground wires come in. Now, the ground system at this installation at Bolinas is almost as famous and much more mysterious than the antenna system itself. But you can see these plowed lines here. These are going out to a plate that's in the Pacific. And there's plowed lines going in this direction to a plate. Maybe this is the bridge here. The bridge still exists under a stream here. And then the rest of them are all going out under this antenna array. Just the most extraordinary thing. And there's a lot of talk about it in some of the literature that we find. We have never been able to actually find it. That's why I say it's still mysterious. If we were able to do any real archaeology, and we know exactly where the plate under the bridge would be, but of course it's federal parkland, so you know what it would take to do some digging there. But anyway, here it is again, another view, and you see a little bit more to the north, and here's the hotel that we were talking about and one of the cottages. So it was a major undertaking. All these other outbuildings that folks used for the construction project, they're long gone. Now here we're looking out again toward, this is a Bolinas Lagoon here and Bolinas Ridge, but the main thing to us is you see the Marconi pattern towers, but you see those plowed lines where the ground system was. And we have the full diagram of it, dated 1914. It's posted at the receive site, and it's just amazing. I look at it all the time. It's hard to believe. And that halo ground, by the way, that circle around building one, we look close at the print, and it talks about a water supply, a half-inch pipe that went through that halo ground to keep it moist all the time. So you had a better ground. Amazing stuff. And for all the infrastructure that they had to do to get those signals across the ocean, still they were able to undercut the cable companies by 50%. Their stocks just went through the basement. It was the end for them. It wasn't really the end for them. They stayed around, but just, you know, this is what we would call today disruptive technology. Well, transmitting system is good, but doesn't work unless you got a receiver as well. So here they are, yeah, dragging the stuff along. This time they're using horses and wheels to build the receive station for the Marconi system up in the town of Marshall, which is about 25 miles north of the transmitting station in Bolinas. And all of those buildings in Marshall still exist. And here's a contemporary view of it. Here is the powerhouse. Now, they did have to build a powerhouse in Marshall, but of course, for the receive site, the power requirement was so much less that it was economical to do it. And here is the hotel, the big hotel, and the two cottages. Now, where the action took place was over here out of the frame, where the actual receivers were. And you can see one of the towers up on the hill. There's seven of them. And you get a little bit more of a view of it here. So this was a single wire antenna. It was not a Beveridge. Now, Beveridge didn't do his work until the late 20s. So not a Beveridge antenna. But they have the single wire antenna. And even with that, and the separation of the 25 miles from Bolinas, the Bolinas signal was so powerful and so broadbanded that they constructed what they call a balancing antenna. Now, one of our colleagues did extensive research on this. I found the results of it, the poles that held it up over on the other side of the hills we're talking about. But this is part of it here. The balancing antenna, what is that? Well, they used it to receive the signal from Bolinas and then phase it out, balance it out, so that they could null it and have a better chance of receiving these impossibly weak signals that were the target from across the ocean. So the towers are long gone up on the hill, up on the ridgeline there, but the anchors and the bases, they'll be there long after all of us are gone. So I went up there with my little hand compass and just to make sure that I was telling the right story and that this was aimed at Hawaii. That was the first link to Hawaii, and then jump over to Japan. Later they were able to make the jump in one hop. And sure enough, you look at the azimuth and bang, right out at Hawaii. Well, okay, First World War takes place, and the United States government says to American Marconi Company, well, great work. You really helped us. Couldn't have won the war without you. Tremendous. Really appreciate it. And by the way, you're done. You're done here. You guys are done. We're going to require that you get out of town and you can sell all your assets. Got to sell all your assets. And of course, they formed the Radio Corporation of America, along with General Electric and others, to receive those assets and become the great radio conglomerate that it all grew to be. But that was his reward. That was the American Marconi Company's reward. And to this day, you probably know that when you fill out the Form 610 to get your radio license and ship it into the FCC, they ask you, there's a question on this, more than 50% of your board of directors non-citizens. And if it is, you're out of luck. So anyway, RCA took over all of those assets. They immediately ripped out the Marconi spark gap transmitter. And we have a magazine article from that era, and the guy says, well, they were so glad to see it go because the guy says, well, the only possible use of that thing would be in wartime to jam every transmission on the coast, because of course, as we know, spark transmissions are fairly broad in their spectrum. So they weren't sad to see that thing go. But here they replaced it, that single spark transmitter, with these two magnificent Alexanderson alternators. Unbelievable machines. As amazing as the Marconi rotary spark gap system was, these put it in the shade. Ernst Alexanderson was an electrical and mechanical genius, and I don't use that term lightly. So here we've got the drive motor, transmission, and the actual alternator, and there's two of them, each one rated at 200,000 watts. 200,000 watts, mechanically generated radio waves. Now the disc in here, inside this thing, is fairly thick at the drive shaft and tapers out to it's very thin at the edge. And it has slots milled in it that are filled with insulating material. And they rotate at tremendous speed in between the stators inside these alternators. Just a small part of the technology that's going on here. But understand, the frequency of the radio wave that you're generating is determined by the amount of revs that are going here. And if that drive shaft moves fore and aft just the slightest bit, you don't have an alternator anymore. You've got shrapnel. It's the end. Never happened. These things were dead reliable machines. And this is what you needed if you're going to be in the transoceanic radio business around that time. These were installed in 1920. And they were just amazing. And I already mentioned the power, 200,000 watts, but the frequency was also very low by our point of view these days. And that was the theory. If you wanted to get across the ocean, you needed gobs of power and extremely long wavelengths. This one operated around 26 kilohertz. 26 kilocycles, I would say, 26 kc. And that was considered to be fairly high for an alternator, but the antenna at Bolinas wasn't as big as they really wanted it to be. So the frequency was a little bit higher. There is one of these still existing in the world today at Ernst Alexandersson's hometown in Sweden. And that one operates on 17.2 kc. Now, one of our guys made the visit to see that great machine. He approached it reverently and touched the sacred casting and then backed away, bowing, and never washed his hand again. No, I made up the part about washing the hand, but that's the reverence that you have for these things. Just astounding. And here's the whole system. The things that Ernst Alexandersson invented were not just the alternators, good, but not good enough. You needed all the tuning circuits. He invented the magnetic amplifier. This was a continuous wave transmitter, just CW transmitter, and you could modulate it. You could put AM on it. Mainly it was modulated just on and off, so you could send Morse with it. Well, okay, back to Marconi. I mean, we already said everybody knows that if you're going to go intercontinental radio business, you need gobs of power and the longest possible wavelengths. Now, he's still in business, he's still very successful, and he has his own yacht, the Electra. Now, he used it for his wireless experiments. He also used it to entertain ladies. He was a great ladies' man. But he had it outfitted for all his wireless experiments down below. And he started getting the inkling that maybe this gobs of power and enormously long wavelengths, maybe that really wasn't it. He started hearing they had a shortwave transmitter, or what we would still by us be considered fairly long wave, but shortwave transmitters by the view of the day, and he's getting daylight signals over tremendous distances, and it doesn't understand it. Nobody understands it. It took forever for people to realize that there's a giant mirror in the sky that allows these radio waves to propagate. Doesn't understand it, and he has contracts in the southern hemisphere to build powered Alexanderson alternator low frequency stations. And he could build that and he could get paid for it, and it would be, but he realized maybe that's not it. Maybe the future is different. And once again, bet his reputation, bet his fortune, bet his company, said, no, I'm not going to, I know I've contracted for these long wave stations. I'm not going to build them. I'm going to build short wave stations. If they don't work, don't pay me, but I think they're going to work. Of course, the company directors, they're having a heart attack over this, but he built it. And of course, we know they did work. Shortwave was, again, disruptive technology. Now, here is one of the experimental shortwave transmitters at Bolinas, 95 meters, right? So these days, the hams among us consider that to be a fairly low frequency, but that was considered shortwave by then, call sign KEL. Now, the reason I include it is what I love the most is the safety protection here. You put up a pipe fence around the thing, and that's it. Okay, there's what, 5, 10, 15,000 volts on the plate here. If you don't know enough not to keep your hand out of the transmitter when it's on the air, you deserve what you get. And that's a put a fence around it. What's good, show this photo to the OSHA representative, she'd have a heart attack. But that's how they did it. That's how they did it, because men knew what they were doing then. Now, here's the picture of the Bolinas transmitter site again. Out here, building 1. Here, building 2 to house all the new shortwave transmitters. And you see how many more antennas, because you could run multiple circuits to all different countries of the world using shortwave. Amazing. Now here's now an aerial view, and you see off in the distance all these antennas, and you see this. The heck is that? It's a guy, right? A guy on the guide, a guy riding the guy wires. Now we have the bosun's chair that this guy was probably using. It looks like one of those inline skates, except it's inverted and it's at an angle, and he runs up and down on the guy wire. Brass ones, man. I'm telling you, those riggers, amazing. Well, here's the new receive station. The one in Marshall that they built for long wave, that just didn't have the flat land that they needed for all the antennas you just saw. So this is the new receive station that was built for the point-to-point high frequency reception. And this is where also after World War II, the KPH receiver site was moved to. So this is where we operate the station from, with transmitters in Bolinas, just like they always were, and the receive site here at Point Reyes. So when you come to visit, when we can be open again, this is where you'll come. And we can also get you a special pass to go down and see the Bolinas site too. But what a magnificent building, just beautiful. Now upstairs, here's what it was all built for. All these unbelievably wonderful dual diversity and triple diversity receivers. And I got to see this. I took this picture. I got to see this when I was there in 1972. And you can imagine I was just blown away. And one of the things I remember most was that above each of these receivers is the name of the country that it's listening to, the city that it's listening to. And I just thought, that was the greatest thing ever. I mean, you know, these guys just let me in there. I'm obviously this, you know, wild man, radio wild man, but they let me in there and I could see all this stuff. So what happens? Well, in the end of 1972, by 1973, the point-to-point service is gone. All of these ripped out, scrapped, and replaced up in this room by a satellite earth station. An outrage, an outrage. I mean, the satellite earth station worked great, but it had absolutely no soul. So we had nothing to show you of the point-to-point system. Well, we keep looking and looking and looking, and finally I find a guy in Germany who has all of the components for one of the point-to-point receivers like you saw in the previous photo. So I said, okay, look, put everything in a box, put the box on the ship, I'll send you money. We want everything, send us everything. So here it is being unloaded from my Jeep. And here it is under restoration by one of our guys who is just amazingly competent. You just get an idea, a slight idea of all there is. And these are not like any other receivers you and I have ever worked with. So to have someone who was not only able to understand them, but willing to undertake the gargantuan job of restoring one of these things, took over a year, of course, to do this. It was just amazing, just an emblematic of the kind of folks that we have as part of our organization. And here it is. It's installed back at the receive site. Now this spot is downstairs, but it's historically correct because that's, once they were building that satellite earth station upstairs, they still had a couple of circuits on HF and the receivers for it were right at this spot. So this is a historically correct spot for it. And this receiver is working. And here you see the little step and the handhold. Step on there, you grab your handhold, you step up, and there was some controls up in here, and you tune your receiver. Unbelievable. But we're very, very proud. And again, this is, like so many things at the project, the only place in the world you're going to not only see one of these, but actually see it in operation. And we have 2 others that are awaiting restoration. Well, here is a log from the corresponding transmitters in Hawaii that we're sending to the Point Reyes receive site. And we were just so lucky to find these up in the archives of the Marshall receive site. And here it says the call sign KEQ of their transmitter, and it talks about graying out in San Francisco. And he'd made a mistake here. He forgot to change the proper crystal shifting. So San Francisco calls him and said, look, you're on the wrong frequency. What are you going to do about that? But we know for sure that this transmitter 29E, was sending to one of the receivers actually at that place. To me, this seeing something like this, and there's a whole wedge of these logs, and it just make, for me anyway, fascinating, fascinating reading. Well, here's our transmitter gallery upstairs at the Bolinas site. This is what we were confronted with when we first got there. Now, this station went off the air, as I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention, in 1997, and told you about the impact that it had. Now, I didn't lose my job, I didn't lose my career, but it took me 2 years to come to that receive station in Point Reyes that we saw the picture of. Because of the emotional impact. I walk in that door along with co-founder Tom Horsfall. We go down that long center hallway and walk into the receive room. And I know the joint's closed for 2 years, and I'm hearing static and Morse code and ships calling. I know the joint's closed, and I walk in there, and it still gives me goosebumps. It was like they had left 20 minutes ago, and they intentionally left the receivers on, keeping a symbolic watch over the airwaves. That's what they thought about their profession. Well, here is the corresponding transmitter site as we saw it, except this is about 1,000 times cleaner. There was a giant pile of trash all up and down the corridor here, but you get an idea. Here's the ones in the foreground, the big ones. Those are the RCA transmitters from 1950s vintage, and then the beige ones. There's 2 rows of those, and they replaced the 2 of the RCA stations. These are made by Henry, and so this is what we had to work with. And all of these, almost all of them, have been restored, but the one that we didn't restore was the most intimidating transmitter of all, what we call an H set. It was the corresponding transmitter to that R3 diversity receiver that we saw, because the thing was enormously complex electrically and mechanically, and this is an example of the condition. I mean, who wouldn't lose heart? We did. Except now comes a bunch of guys from Hewlett-Packard, volunteers, and we say, okay, you want a project? Yeah, we want a project. We're having fun doing what we're doing, but we want something we can really bite into. Okay, how about you restore this H set? This is what it looked like, just that deck after they got done with it. On and on and on. Rebuilt that thing till it looked like it came from the factory. Unbelievable work. Took them 3 years to do it. Here's the new final tubes on the deck as the thing is coming together. And here's Steve Pizar. This is the guy who restored the R3 receiver, and he also was instrumental in restoring this H set transmitter 298, tuning it up for the first time. And here, okay, this is 2013. Our Night of Nights, our big annual event's called Night of Nights. The woman in the foreground who's about to press the money button, that's the superintendent of the Point Reyes National Seashore. She's the boss. She's our boss. And you can see me peeking around the corner here, and you can almost see the thought bubble above my head, which is saying, please, don't let this thing catch on fire. And of course, there was no chance of that because the workmanship was superb. So she pressed the button and bam, it's on the air for the first time since forever. And we actually had one of the guys who worked on this during the time it was functional, actually there that night. So again, the only place you're going to see this anywhere in the world is you're going to see one of these. There is one on the East Coast, but the only place you're going to see one working. Amazing. Well, okay. I see we're almost an hour into it. I guess I should probably be quiet for a minute and see what we want to do next.